Okay, I think we're just about on the mark here, so get going. Just a second. Let folks get a seat. Okay, well, glad to see a full house. Hopefully I don't disappoint and we have out in the open, because everyone I've been in this room so far have been a very technical presentation. This isn't a technical presentation. No Python code on the screen, although that's all very interesting. This is more around kind of covering, I mean, very briefly, yes, there's huge opportunity in data. You guys wouldn't be here if you didn't believe that, I don't think. A little bit around why we have such a high failure rate, and then some lessons learned that over the years we've been able to prove out. You know, I call it tricks, which is probably underestimating how hard it is to do some of these things. They're not necessarily easy, but for companies that do them and do them well, the payoffs are huge. So quick background on myself. I can summarize this by saying I've been doing this a long time. Over 25 years, kind of stumbled into, back when it was called Decision Support Systems in the early 90s. Haven't left it since. There's a reason for that. Very exciting, changes rapidly, always something new to learn. And it's one of the few places, I'm in consulting now, but spent over half of my career actually running data groups, data science groups within the business. You get the broadest view of the business and you can have a huge impact on the business. It's probably the one place where you have that type of potential within an organization. Prior to getting into this, I ran EMC, now Dell EMC. I ran their global data solutions group for 7 years. Did the same thing for Alcoa for 5 years. So I've been here, and like I said, I don't know how many folks here are like kind of on the IT side or the business side in a company versus maybe provide services, but I've been on both sides of it and enjoyed both sides of it. So just quickly, everybody knows more and more data all the time. And companies are still struggling, to this day to get their hands around it, but there's no debate on the potential value there. That first graphic was really out of some studies that said, depending on which one you read, somewhere between 0.01% to 5% of all data that's generated these days is actually used and leveraged for analytics. That doesn't mean that every piece of data is a relevant piece of data if you can harness it to get a lot more value out of the data that's available to you. What data do you have? Then you're trying to apply analytics and gain insights out of that to generate that value, and then you hope to get outcomes out of it and capture it. And we'll talk about that a little bit. The other thing on this side a little bit is the conversation's been changing recently. When I first got back into consulting about 5 years ago, it was still big data analytics. That was the hot term. Now everybody's talking about digital transformation and transformation. And guess what? Data's still at the heart of that. It's it's a little bit different than just pure old big data analytics because it brings in some other things, but it's, without the data and without the insights from the data, you can't really do transformation. We have a robotic process automation group a peer of mine runs. We're constantly together on initiatives because without good data, you can't run your robots, right? And we'll talk a little bit about strategy and the importance of defining strategy. And I use this picture just to depict many companies, especially at the executive levels. They spend a lot of time talking about what they want as a strategy for the company. Do we want to, we want to be the product of choice. We want to be the low-cost provider, so let's have efficient operations. We want to have, everybody wants profitable growth, although there's a few examples of companies that have done very well with unprofitable growth. But typically, you want to make money and you want to grow, right? Or you might want to have unique insights, something that nobody else has, or you want to be the disruptor, you don't want to be the disrupted, right? And so they sound like great ideas, but oftentimes they then fall short, and obviously this is data-oriented, but more and more these days, you need to have a data strategy to help execute that, and it's not just around how you manage the data and how you do analytics. It's much broader than that, and gets into the governance, gets into acquisition and integration of data sources. All these things, I've walked into companies. Hey, we want to, upgrade our retail experience. How are we going to do that? When, they saw that as a digital transformation initiative, trying to get, capture more customers through more immersive sites. And in the end, the strategy was like 70% data and analytics and 30% new stores, new whatever, right? So, and it was quite an eye-opening thing to them. So, so lots of new opportunity, many more people doing it than were doing it in like early 90s. And so you hear more successes, and that might make you believe that that's because we're getting better at it. Reality is we're not. You're hearing more successes only because there's more people doing it. Depending on whose research you look at and how they're measuring success, it's somewhere between 50 and 75 to 80% failure rate, right? And that just depends on, is it an outright failure, or did it just kind of not meet full expectations and how they measure that? But this is just a little bit. I tried to get some that were older than 2015. I couldn't find them fast enough through my Google search. But if you look at it, 2019, 80% of data science projects never make it into production. My experience says sometimes that's a good thing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But 77% of businesses report the business adoption. We'll talk about that. That gets into the data culture aspect of it, right? If you can't get the business to adopt it, right, it's just fancy math, right, and visualization. Gartner, 80% analytics insights will not deliver business outcomes through 2022. This went back into Forbes. This guy was actually pretty optimistic. He thought, half of data projects would fail. It's actually been typically higher than that. And then this one was kind of funny because Gartner in 2016 said back and did kind of like a small print. Oh, by the way, we were actually wrong. It was, 85%. So, having done this for a long time, it's really frustrating that, we're not getting better at it, right? And I think a lot of it, we tend to focus, like I said, we focus a lot on the technology, the science of doing data science, how do we get good data, but we don't focus a lot on some of the other things that are critical. And that's really where I wanted to spend a fair amount of our time here. I talked about strategy. It's amazing how many companies, if you go in and you ask them, as we do you have a strategy? Some will be honest and say no, but those are usually the ones that, are just getting started. Most people say, oh yeah, we have a strategy. When you start digging into the components of what we feel is a true end-to-end strategy, they're always missing something, right? And they haven't oftentimes thought through or have a process in place that ensures that, okay, we created a strategy. We're all proud. It's aimed at our strategic goals. We have this process. We've thought through this. But life changes, business changes, markets change. They also don't have processes in place to make sure that that strategy, that ship continues to follow the right course along the way. Ownership is that four-letter word called governance that most people hate to deal with. But this is governance not just from data governance, which most people are aware of, but governance from, hey, if you want, if we all agree that this is the right strategy, then you need the business and executive support to make sure that it gets pushed down through the organization, adoption happens, everybody realizes that they have a stake in the game, they all play their role in the accountability for success, right? Not just, oh yeah, thanks, I helped you define your strategy, now IT or data science group go deliver it, right? It's engaged through the whole thing. Obviously, data governance is important as well, but so it's much more than just data governance, which is why I call it ownership. And then culture is really where it's really around the adoption aspect of it, right? Unless you build, and I said I worked for EMC. When I first started there, it wasn't until, started there in 2007, it wasn't until the latter half of 2009 that they really started taking it seriously. And the reason was they were astronomically successful, growing at 15, 20% year after year for over a decade. Success is like the biggest enemy of analytics, right? Because they had been doing that on gut feel. Why should we change anything, right? It wasn't until the downturn and they had their first quarter of single-digit growth, still growth, that they started taking it seriously. And as a matter of fact, It was also when they decided to get into the big data and analytics business and not just the storage business. So when that happened, things really started to change. So the progress we made between 2009 to 2015 when I left was astronomical, but that was because we now had leadership buy-in, and we had a culture of you can't walk into a meeting and say, I'm going to do this because I want to do this. It has to be backed up with data, and you better have something to support it, and it was managed through the whole system. So start a little bit, and by the way, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. I know, especially as we start into these, they're fairly meaty topics. So strategy. So the biggest difference when I work with somebody on a strategy, well, obviously if you don't have a strategy, if you don't know where you're headed, you're going to have a hard time getting there, right? Trying to drive from Tennessee to San Francisco, but you don't know you're headed to San Francisco, you just know you're headed west. It's going to be an interesting journey, right? So understanding where you want to get to, and also understanding that that destination could change over time, is critical. So understanding that end result, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The timing and what's required to actually get there. And when we say what's required to get there, it's not just the technology, the data science team, the proper data, and a good, cloud-based platform. It's everything. What kind of process change is going to be required? What kind of training is going to need to be required? How are you actually going to capture that value? And is it even feasible in your current culture to do that? It might be a great idea. An example that, from a client, there's huge upside opportunity in optimizing their sales price on merchandise. It was also a huge cultural change because all their store managers had complete authority over what they wanted to price something for. So when we're going through creating a roadmap, and we'll get into the prioritization, that was a pretty high negative score for tackling that one early on. We still did, just because the upside was so huge. But but you have to look at that whole thing, and understand. Because the people doing the analytics almost never have the control over the business process side, right? You can have the greatest insights. First, you have the challenge of communicating it effectively so they understand what it is they need to do and why they should do it, but then you also need them to buy in and actually institute the process change. So the plan for change, and then measuring the business benefits. One of the biggest ways to, and it's very often not thought of, at least in my experience, you do the analysis and you say, hey, it's a $5 million opportunity, but many people don't then go measure what they actually got out of it. Yes, that's important, but it's more important to also drive adoption, because once success breeds followers, right? So if you're able to demonstrate success, everybody else starts to come on board. So I've been to a couple presentations, and they all talk about defining the problem. When we talk about, the objectives and the hypotheses around those objectives, we like to perform workshops. They're usually a half day to a day, right? But it's with senior level executives, right? I mean, if it's like a mid-sized company, it's like C-level executives we want in there, right? If it's a large global conglomerate, matter of fact, this picture's from one that we did with a company in Mexico. It was the leadership for that region, but it was senior level leadership that when they walked out of that room and there was agreement that these are priority items we want to look into, and we understand, because we look into it, this is the beginning of looking into what's it actually going to take. Okay, great idea, high potential value, everybody agrees with that, but then what's the cultural fit on this? How hard is this going to actually be in your organization? And it's those business leaders are the only ones that can answer those questions, and so that's why you need to have them in the room. Then you start. This doesn't happen in the workshop. The workshop, when you're working at that level, we'll call it t-shirt sizing or whatever, but you come up with placeholders for ranges of value, right? And depending on the company, $1 million might be a high value for one company, but it's small for another because of their size. So, small, medium, large, whatever you want to define those ranges at, that can be normalized across the measures. But then you start applying weights, and you start applying, ways to measure these things. And in the end, what you come out with is, we use a bubble chart quite a bit. And basically what this is saying is organizational impact, how hard is this going to be, right? From an organization perspective, not technology perspective. Implementation complexity, that's more the technology aspect of it. Do we have the data? Do we have the skills? Do we have the technology? And then what's the potential value of the size of the bubble? So obviously, the further you are down to the lower left, the easier it's going to be to do. Further you are out to the upper right, the harder it's going to be to do. Size of the bubble is relative value. So it quickly gives them a visualization to sit there and say, okay, let's pick a few things. And most of the time, we end up picking top 2 or 3 and say, okay, now let's go after these. They're not always everything in the lower left-hand corner, right? Like I said, the one retailer, and this is actually from the retailer, that was the price optimization. But everybody, like, there was just across-the-board agreement from a leadership perspective, that's something we need to tackle. We're leaving a lot of money on the table. And so that ended up being one of the first 3 that we went after. But getting that agreement from the executives before you start moving forward. Then, I don't know why I have so many bullets on this slide. And then another key difference, and I heard a few people in this conference, and you see it more and more often. It's, when I first started getting into advanced analytics projects, certainly data warehousing projects before that, it was, let's define this scope, some objective that's 12 months, 18 months out, cost us $1 million, $2 million. Let's put the project together, build the team, let's start going. And then, when you have a failure in those situations, it's much more painful. So what we recommend, call this our analytics innovation cycle sometimes, but whatever you call it, it's basically a process of, testing these things out quickly. So going through the discovery, which is basically the workshop, and getting the foundation and agreement on what it is you're going to go after. Obviously, then you have to prep that data, build the models, get the findings, and then that cycle, I didn't put the time frame in here, but we try to time box, or we suggest you time box that cycle in somewhere in the 4 to 6 week range. So a lot of people that have worked on analytics projects will go, how in the world can we do, the whole thing in 4 to 6 weeks? You have to scope down the question, right? Yes, I've had some that are 8 to 12 weeks just because we couldn't find any way to break it down into smaller chunks. But the goal being, try to get to an answer on a hypothesis, right? So, the pricing one. Is there really value in this, and how much value is there, right? And let the data prove it. Get to that answer, and then decide whether or not you're going to operationalize it and roll it out into the company. Because that operationalized step can be much longer, right? And can be much more expensive. But at least if you're very confident, or as confident as you can be based on the data, that it's going to bring success, then it's a lot easier investment decision. The other thing when I was practicing this in my head, findings, or model building actually, it's really easy for a team to get distracted at this point, because you've asked them, if you've done this right, you've asked them to really scope down the question, right? So another example was a high-tech manufacturer. It was actually EMC, but there was a question. The question they wanted to answer was, hey, it looks like we have a drive model out there that's pretty high failure rates, right? So do we actually have, And everybody was scared about it because we had had one a couple years before that had cost us millions of dollars because we had to go out and replace these drives and everybody's equipment. It's like, oh man, I hope the answer is no to this. But basically the process was, do we really have a quality problem? And then what do we need to do about it? Well, in the process of going through that and analyzing the data, I mean, they're all, oh, maybe we could have better cooling in this device. Oh, maybe the power supply is a little too big in this. And it's like, these will always spawn more hypotheses, but if you let the team go off and start chasing those, you won't get, so it was a constant process of saying, hey, yeah, add that to the backlog, good question, good hypothesis, but it's not getting us to the answer that we're being asked to answer right now. In the end, in that case, it ended up being that it was a cooling problem. The drive wasn't really the problem. It was that the drive, when it was installed too close to the power supply, was more susceptible to heat. So the process instead was just don't install it there anymore. So it was a much better answer for the business. And then we had a lot of interesting questions to follow up on after the fact. One of them I talked about was it was pretty easy for them to decide to move the power supply from the top corner to the bottom corner, and so we did more analysis to figure out that yeah, that would be a good change to the product configuration, et cetera. If it wasn't clear, it's just trying to get an answer, a data-backed answer, as quickly as possible to make sure that your investment that you're going forward with is successful. And nobody needs to stand up in front of an executive and say, sorry, we just spent X millions of dollars, but it doesn't look like we're going to have any success here. And very large financial institution, that's exactly what they did. They came to us and said, we've spent tens of millions of dollars in the last 5 years on this platform. My business leaders are saying they're not getting the value out of it. First question I ask is, do you know how they're measuring that value? No. Well, if you don't know how they're measuring the value, how are you going to know how to fix it, right? And understanding. So a classic example of not really understanding what the business was trying to accomplish, just building a platform. This was back in the data lake days where it was just common to build a platform and throw a bunch of data in it and expect value to come out. But this was just an example. This was also from the retailer, but of some of the output from that particular what we call proof of value exercise. And it easily, just so you know, this was some analysis that said, here's every place that we're selling, the price that we're selling a particular title at. We looked at 1,700 titles. They literally have hundreds of thousands. But just said, and then looking at things like impact on all kinds of variables that went into that the data scientists worked on and said, look, you could be selling at this price quite a bit higher. This is dollars, by the way. That's $9. It was relatively cheap. And you're giving up X amount of revenue by doing that. So then it was just a easy decision for them to say, you know what? We are going to take that power away from our store managers. We're going to educate them on why. We're going to implement a new pricing module in our systems. This took us roughly 6 weeks to come to because their data was a little bit questionable in some cases, hard to get at. It took us about 6 weeks to do that analysis. It's taken them about 4 months to get the module implemented in production and then start rolling it out to the stores. But it proved to, and the interesting thing is when we started that, the CEO, the CFO and CIO were the ones that wanted to do this. The CEO was very skeptical, but said, hey, I'm gonna let them run with it. And when we came out with this analysis and presented it, she said, I knew that we were underpricing our inventory. So it was interesting. It proved her gut feel in this case, but did it with numbers. So became a supporter after that. So that's a little bit on strategy and getting to answers quickly. Any questions on that real quick? I'm good on time. Data culture. So a well-functioning data culture kind of follows this process, right? You have the left side of this, running the business, creating data, basically. Creating business, hopefully, and revenue, but also creating data. That data feeds into a process of, analyzing the business operations, doing advanced analytics, identifying opportunities for innovation and improvement, which then get fed back into the business, change operations, get more value. Guess what? That generates more detail, generates more insights, and you continually have this feedback curve. I don't think there's a pointer here. Many, many, many times, this is where it fails. So that's the business adoption side of it, right? It's, you get all the way to the insights and you say, you should be doing this. The expectation, just from my own past, first truly predictive analytics project that I did on contract renewal revenue uplift. It's like, hey, we think we could be capturing more revenue from support contract renewals. Actually, there's a set of support contracts that we would rather not renew because we lose money on them, but we want to get an uplift. Got a quick project together, followed that process that I talked about, except for our analysis of what was going to be required for adoption was a little flawed, but at least we tried to do it. Was deemed a success, showed huge uplift potential, were able to score the pipeline, trained all the sales folks on how to use the report. Quarter goes by, nothing. No change, up or down in our typical renewal pace. Went and did a post-mortem, found out, look, the sales guys are in salesforce.com all day long. They're not, when we first deployed the dashboards, yeah, they went out and ran them, said, oh, this is cool. But when they got back to running their day-to-day lives, they were living by their pipeline and their next opportunities in Salesforce. Couple-week project to feed those scores and attach them and by that, the next quarter, $100 million uplift per quarter, ongoing, as a $26 billion company, but still material increase, right? Just by that one last step of really understanding what's it going to take to capture the value and really get this into the hands of folks. If you're delivering to, let's say, people that are used, their job is to work with data and information, a dashboard may be enough, right? They're making decisions based off of data, that's their job. When you're talking about trying to roll this out into a sales organization or a marketing organization, that's not their day, or an engineering organization, right? Where that's not their day-to-day job is to go run a dashboard. You have to find more creative ways of getting that accomplished. And so that was just one example. So this is kind of my puzzle picture. That, what are the different pieces of building a data culture? All of these are important, but if I were to call out three that, in my experience, are the most important and also most often overlooked, one is the recruiting the evangelists. So every organization that I've been a part of where I was responsible for delivering these things, I sought out somebody who was well respected in the organization, had authority, right? And would be a champion of what we were doing, right? And would not go, water cooler talk about the failures, but would, yell loudly about the successes and bring everything in. I go back to my Alcoa days. He was the CIO of Alcoa Europe. Loved this, thought we should be doing more of it. Knew a lot of the board members personally. Could just get anything approved as long as I convinced him it was good, right? And then would go present the story to everybody. Company we're at right now, it's the university, it's the CIO for the school, or CFO for the school. She came from someplace that was doing a better job, very big on it, has authority, right? So finding those evangelists and then partnering with them. A lot of people have a tendency, and I did as well, of trying to make the squeaky wheel happy, right? The one that was most skeptical, or the one who, and it's almost always a losing battle because they will undersell the successes and they'll oversell the failures at first. But if you find, I used to call them friends of analytics, but if you find these supporters, then like I said, success breeds followers, even if they're a little bit skeptical. Second most important is educate. And that's a big part on the data culture. A lot of organizations feel, oh, I mean, this is a data world. Everybody understands how to use data. I'll give them a dashboard. They'll understand what they're supposed to do. Or I'll train them on the tool, and they'll, everything will be fine. But really educating the entire organization on what it means to use data, what role that plays in their job contextually, right? How that's going to benefit them, how it's being measured. But then also having a support mechanism. So one of the first clients I had when I got back into consulting, their data and analytics team was considered like a huge failure. And oh my gosh, we went and talked to the executives, all kinds of bad press. Went in, and within the first 3 weeks, we found out that this education, yes, they had some problems, but they had rolled out this SAP-based solution like 3 years prior, did a one-time education process. Well, guess what? Most of those people no longer were in those roles anymore, right? They had implemented many, many improvements over the past 3 years, right? So one of the big successes of that whole thing wasn't all the other stuff that we did while we were there. It was just we set up basically a helpline, if you want to call it that, but a war room and some basic training. We ran, we call it 101 and 102 training. We ran over 200 people through that, and then had regular office hours on Tuesday and Wednesday. Bring your problem, right? We will help you solve your problem. Seems pretty simple, but man, that was a huge success. An organization, there's another company I've been working with, they've done an excellent job with a user group. I think I cover that a little bit in a minute, but where it's like a community of interest user group type of thing. And they have competitions. Who built the best data visualization? Here's a prize. What's everybody doing? Present things just to get everybody educated on what's going on and interested in what's going on. So those types of things can bring a lot of success and build a culture. That's actually a good way to build culture from the grassroots as opposed from trying to push it from the top down. And then enable collaboration. There's still a lot of artificial silos in organizations. What I'll say here is, like that user group, there's small things you can do around collaboration, getting the data scientists together. If you're a large organization, I'm sure there's pockets of people doing this all over your company. Getting those folks together and letting them share what they're doing opens up opportunities to collaborate, which we'll get to later, that can substantially, many times over, increase the potential value and the rate of return that you're getting out of these things. Now, this is one place where technology plays a role and process plays a role. How do you actually facilitate that? Got to worry about data security. You have to have an environment that actually supports collaboration, things like that. But most of it's culture and just breaking down those barriers. I just like this slide. I put it in. It was actually one of my data scientists that did this one to open my eyes up at one point early in the days. He's like, look, analytics is a team sport, right? So it requires all of these roles, if not more, to actually get to the value, right? The business users are going to be the ones that have to actually implement this thing, get value out of it. You got the developers, you have the data scientists, you have the data wranglers or data architects, you have the business process owners that are the only ones that can institute business process change. You have to get all these people involved from the ground up. His comment to me was, look, I can do, but I don't really want to do it. I want to be doing the data science work, and you're paying me good money, right, to do work that somebody else could be doing, and it's slowing down overall progress. So when we talk about those analytics innovation teams, kind of a roundabout way of getting to this, but it should have membership from all of these. So when you're going through that 4 to 6 week, it needs to have membership from all of these, right? Because as you're going through that, you're going to be learning new things, and you're going to be learning, really what's going to have to happen on the business side to capture the value and deliver it to the organization. And if they're in it from the beginning, one, they'll feel a commitment to it and a sense of accountability. But two, it won't come as a surprise when now all of a sudden you throw something out to them and say you have to change your business process in order to accomplish this. And then this is just, it's a busy slide, but it's just saying, you know, if you're going to ask people to behave differently, you have to have an element of change management in that whole process. And it's not just, you know, a lot of people think of change, oh, that's communication, making sure people know what's coming. Oh, that's training them on the new tool. Oh, that's, you know, defining new job roles. It's actually all of those things, but then it's also a lot of just soft skills. They understand their role in it, and they understand how it's going to impact them. It's amazing to me how many folks, when they hear there's a data and analytics project going on, folks out in the business, the operational, oh, they're doing an analytics project, they're going to maybe get rid of my job, or I'm going to have to do something different. Letting them know, one of the best CIOs I ever had, sometimes you do have to deliver a little bit of a scary message depending on what you're doing. But he was very upfront every time. He's like, this is exactly what we're doing, right? This is how your role is going to change. You either change with it, or you have a certain amount of time to go find a job that, you know, where you can still do what you're used to doing. But I appreciated that. It was very upfront. People knew what was coming. It's very similar as you're going through these processes. But a lot of organizations are scared to do that. But what I found is most people will want to, you know, change and adopt it if they understand what it is and feel comfortable about it. This gets to the collaborative part. So I had to put in one technology slide, albeit a very high-level technology slide. But reference architecture that I believe in strongly is self-service analytics, right? And the reason being, having been on the IT side most of my career, I'm never given enough people or enough time to do everything that the business wants to do. And by the way, I don't have the closeness and knowledge of how the business is operating and changing on a day-to-day basis. What IT does well is this, right? They build large, reliable, hopefully, platforms. They deliver data. They can collect lots of data. They can make it available to folks. They can run governance processes or enforce governance processes. They shouldn't be running them. They can ensure security. They can do that kind of stuff. What the business does well, or the analytics groups do well, is they understand the business. They understand their data. They may not understand all the technical components of it. And that's where IT comes in again. But accelerating that process. Now, this doesn't mean the Wild West. The first time I did this, my team wanted to drag me into the alley and beat me up because they all thought they're going to be out of work because they did that work, right? Reality was it became more in demand than ever because it just accelerated the use of the data and the platform across the organization. And they actually elevated their skill set to be more consultants than the actual writing the Tableau report, right? But you have to have the right processes in place and governance in place to support that. Lots of war stories of the early days of, you know, giving too much control and, you know, data getting into the hands of some clients that, you know, scared the heck out of them because somebody ran a report incorrectly or developed it incorrectly. So you do have to think about the output side as well as the input side when you're talking about governance. But if you do that correctly and then have a process to get these, you know, if a business, this is another common scenario, I'll still call them shadow IT, business run IT, whatever you want to do. They're very good at creating new value. They're not so good, typically, at the security, the scalability, the performance, that type of stuff, right? So oftentimes it'll be like, hey, this is great, and then they collapse under their own success because it becomes so successful, and now they no longer have the support mechanism in place to actually support it the way it needs to be supported 24/7, et cetera. It's become such a critical component of the business operations. So you have to have that process that says, okay, now here's when and how we would transition that over to be a centrally run process. The value of having this common platform, though, is they've built it in the same tools that you're using on the other side of the fence, right? So pretty easy to do that transition as opposed to when, you know, I had a business group come up to me and say, hey, we need you to take this over. Oh, great, what's it in? TM1. we don't support TM1, right? You're going to have to rewrite the whole thing. Well, why would we rewrite? So it avoids all those arguments, right? And accelerates that process. But the other piece that it does is up here, is it facilitates the collaboration, right? Because now, not only are IT and the business using the same technologies and platform, the different business units are using the same technology and platform. So now when one group comes up with a really cool new data set, right, it's on the platform, right? The other group can just use it. It's not a process of trying to figure out, how do you get it from one place to the other. So it really accelerates and the different data groups can work collaboratively on projects as well, really accelerating the pace of change. Ownership. I only have a couple slides on this because it's boring but important. So I talked about program governance. This is just kind of a reference architecture, right? But the key components being, you have the executives up here. They're kind of providing overall guidance, overall, error support, making sure things get funded that need to get funded, dispute resolution if you can't come to an agreement. Hopefully that's not very often. Then you have the actual program team. Those are the ones running it on a day-to-day basis, making sure that things are, getting completed, et cetera, getting implemented out into the business, doing the change management, et cetera. And then you kind of have these down here. The agile teams, that's really getting into kind of like those analytics innovation teams and just really rapid cycles and making sure that you're getting it done. Architecture obviously is saying, hey, are you looking at security? Are you looking at, our standards? No, don't bring in this other third-party tool. We have one that already does that, et cetera. But then the working groups is actually where a lot of the activity happens because they're really formed temporarily to tackle a particular problem, right? So it's like, whether it be data governance, whether it be a new analytics project, it's like, who are the right people to solve this problem? Who are the right people to, figure out what we need to do for price optimization and what's going to happen? Oh, it's these people. You pull them together, they become a working group, but underneath that overall umbrella. Exactly how this gets implemented, who plays in it, it's going to be very dependent on the culture of the company. Are you a, more autocratic type of company, or of a, entrepreneurial type of company where you're going to have a lot more grassroots and process to make sure this works properly, et cetera. But it's critical that it be in place. And this will look very similar because it's a similar structure, but data governance. And oftentimes what I've found in mature organizations, a lot of times it's the same people sitting on both of these because they tend to be, the ones that get nominated tend to be the ones that are, big into the data and understand the data and the business processes so they can serve on both. But similar process, just a different goal, and this is around, the data governance programs. Oops. This was a real one out of a finance initiative. Forgot to drop finance. But you have the executive governance board serve a very similar process. The day-to-day information governance, which is where the data storage, data SMEs, data architects, those folks live and solve these things on a day-to-day basis. Make sure data dictionaries get filled out and processes get completed. Security concerns get addressed and standards around access, right? So one of the biggest pushbacks always when you try to introduce self-service analytics is, wait a second, we can't, have people having access to this data. And in some cases, yes, but as long as you have a process that says who's allowed to, right, and then have a process to make sure that that gets followed, it allows you to take more of a stance of, hey, I always try to encourage, take a stance of, yeah, you're allowed to have access to it unless some rule says you can't, as opposed to, no, you can't have access to anything unless some rule says you can, right, if you take the opposite approach. In this, I've now, although most of my personal background is running organizations, haven't been like in highly regulated companies. I've now worked at some, medical and healthcare places and insurance and other places that are much more regulated. It's a much bigger cultural shift to get them to open that up, but reality is there are ways to do it, right? One insurance company, we had to jump through a lot of hoops. First they said, no, we can never put this in the cloud, found a way to get it in the cloud. Oh, no, nobody can have access to this data. It's, super, we can't put it up there in that data store. It has to have its own data store, able to, find an encryption process that encrypted like down to the row level. And anyways, there's always an answer, a technical answer that can address the actual real problems, but you have to uncover the real problems. And then when it's all working well, and so this gets into the collaboration and everything else, this is an example of there were multiple groups within this organization basically trying to tackle the same problem. The goal was make our customers happy, right? Make sure they get good product. Don't get bad product out to the customer. Make sure they have the best experience possible. What can we do, right? So you had product engineering trying to tackle it by saying, well, we're going to try to tackle the problem by making sure that we have, really good analysis and we don't allow product to ship out the door. And guess what? You can go so far with that, but bad product always gets out the door. You had the total customer experience folks trying to tackle it from, okay, what do the tickets look like in the customer? What's the customer experience? What did the survey come back at? What are they saying the problem is? Now can we go and initiate changes within our supporting processes to improve that? Logistics around, okay, how do we make sure we have the right parts in the right place and the right tech folks that can go service when things go bad and make sure that the customer has like zero downtime if at all possible, and analytics around what were the inventory levels, et cetera. And then you had customer service, dealing with the really kind of the cases and the calls and trying to do analysis around that. Each one of those groups had been working for over a year trying to come up with a good answer. And they had pieces of good answers and they'd made some successes, especially kind of down here where it was a little bit more bare metal. Let's try to make sure we have less bad product going out. But it wasn't until it was one of these user group meetings that I talked about where all the data science folks and data analytics folks from all these different groups got together globally actually and started comparing notes. And they're like, you know what, we're all kind of trying to solve the same problem, right? And they got together and worked on it together, defined it together, looked at across the entire breadth of, and the end result was in about 45 days, they had the foundation, not the actual, but they had the actual analytics in place that yielded roughly estimated $50 million annually value. And now that value was measured a few different ways, right? People continued to do business with us. Our exit rate went down. Our number of field calls that we had to cost money to send somebody out into the field and replace a drive, that went down. So kind of all those things added together ended up being that $50 million annually. But it took all of those groups working together to solve a problem in about 45 days or so that they had each been working on individually for over a year. So. And that was it for my presentation. I know it was thank you. Appreciate it. I literally have full presentations on almost every one of those topics, so I know it was a lot in one sitting. But any questions? Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit more about the data steward role,
Mm-hmm.
separate and distinct from like business process owner and business analyst, or can they be the same person, or what's the best practice for a data steward?
They can be the same person. So there was a presentation I was at in the same room where she had this slide of multiple ways to skin a cat. Anyways, I didn't know, I thought I was the only one that ever used that. I thought that wasn't politically correct anymore. But but it depends, really, is the answer, right? But if you look at the data steward's job is to basically take action on any issues that arise with the data and understand, yes, help define the definitions and make sure that the data dictionaries are up to date, but also when an issue comes up and it says, well, you said this definition was ABC, but we're not seeing it as that, they have the connections to go into the business process and figure out, well, why is that, right? Sometimes that's one and the same person. sometimes it's not. I see a lot of times this is temporary to get it off the ground. They'll define it as a separate role, and they'll create like a centralized group because nobody in the business wants to take that extra responsibility on. I would say ideally, though, you would want the data stewards to live in the business because they're the closest to the business, and it just adds a layer of abstraction that doesn't need to be there. So it's a role, not a person, is what I'd say, right? It's a set of activities you need to do, not necessarily an individual.
Well, a lot of the terms you used were very agile-centric. Any of the content, would you change any of the content or have any specific pitfalls for companies that are either not agile or newly agile and don't have a full grasp on the agile process, specifically agile development, not just
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is you can do that analytics innovation process without being agile. It's just a rapid way of, doing a set of work. It's really more about time boxing and clearly defining what you're trying to accomplish in a set period of time and trying to be as strict about that as possible. The first time I implemented that, it was not in an agile environment, right? So I'm probably guilty of using kind of the word agile in more its general form than in the development process form, right?
So I assumed you were talking about agile culture in general.
Yeah. So, but it can work in either one. In my experience, agile works very well. The development process works very well in the analytics world. Works a little bit less well in kind of the data integration side of things when you're talking sourcing big data, but it can work both places. I have lots of failures, yeah. That's where the learnings came from. No, well, I mean, I talked about one of them, which was, we forgot the last step. We said, hey, a dashboard is going to be good enough, right? And it wasn't. And so we went a quarter of no value, where if we had done that properly, we could have gotten it much sooner. Most of the other, so there are other, this might not believe me, but I haven't had any that would be defined as a failure, as in it got canceled and just never made it to production like one of those metrics were. But I've definitely had lots of didn't quite hit expectations. And most of those were all due to not properly defining and setting expectations at the front, right? Or trying to take on more than you could chew. And a lot of those were more back in the data lake and data warehouse days, where the role was, hey, let's just build this giant platform. Say we're going to get X millions of dollars of value for $50,000, right? More often than not, that never materialized because nobody was thinking about a lot of the other things that I put up there, how that value is actually going to be captured. So the way I think about it in my head, during like the analytics innovation process where you're grabbing data, it could be data that's already in your warehouse. It could be something completely new, right, that you're trying to bring in and you're bringing into that workspace. There was a term, it doesn't seem to be as popular anymore, but data wrangler. I mean, to me, that's like the quick and dirty. Get the data in, do the analytics, right? Figure out if it's worth doing the next step, right? An example I'll use there was at companies they wanted to start playing with clickstream data. Twitter data, Twitter Firehose data. They didn't exactly know why or how. It was one division, but they said, hey, can we start getting this in, right? Okay, we just started dumping it in there, right? And just let them, now nobody else had access to it, right? We didn't have any monitoring to make sure it ran 24/7. We didn't do any data quality checks on it. We didn't do just a chance to play with it for a couple months and figure out what it was actually that they needed. Then we went to the next step, which was, okay, we only need this subset of the fire hose. This is exactly what we need. This is what we'll filter it on. And then we did more the ETL, what I call the productionalization, or hardening that and then putting it in the true mainstream data lake and saying, yes, this will be there every morning at 7 a.m., blah, 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 and putting all those extra bells and whistles around it. That's kind of how I differentiate between the two. Common skill set, just slightly different approach. Yes?
How can you run into this? How can you succeed with analytics solution when the business has historically only done operational reporting? You've won over the frontline guys that are actually using the tool and kind of understanding BI analytics, but the leadership of that team or that area, they're old school. They're like, just give me the data and let me handle it, i.e. Excel.
Yeah. I'm actually working at a company right now that has a similar problem. Might sound a little, I actually just talked them out of cutting off access to the old stuff to these folks. I said, look, all you're going to do is make enemies that way. Start shifting your focus on doing the new stuff. And then I had that slide about find the supporters, right? And allow that. And so we've now found a group of well-respected within the organization, but excited about the data and the new access that they're going to have and the types of things. And when we ask them, are you willing to kind of go be the prophet to the rest of the company? Like, yeah, we'd love to do that, right? So finding that group. There's some people you're never going to, I mean, there were folks, there were some executives that like, hey, I want my sheet of paper printed off by my admin every Monday morning with, how we did on sales last week. They're not going to change, but what they will do is if the people within their organization start using it, you can still give them his report or her report every Monday morning if you want to. Successful come. I talked about being at EMC. Talk about trying to, like a tough row for a while because it's a company full of technology folks, right? They built software and hardware for a living, and so they all felt they could do the job better than I could, right? And the last group to get won over was the engineering group because they were the most technical of all. But eventually when they start seeing the success and they start seeing, then they start getting asked, well, why aren't you doing that, right? How come everybody else is doing this and you're not doing it? It's not a magic overnight answer, I know, but that's the way I've seen the most success. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Oops.